Good evening, friends. It's Friday once again, and I'm back with another tale from my collection. Living on the Gulf Coast in 2010, I was attending pre-med classes in Houston when the Deepwater Horizon oil spill accident happened. I have a deep love for the Gulf Coast, and this accident bothered me so much, I was inspired to write my novel, Tides of Evolution. A few weeks ago, I posted The Lagoon, which is from that novel, and tonight, I would like to share another excerpt from the same book. Now it's time to grab a snack, dim the lights, and let me take you into the night with a story I call My Friend David. Driving the Jeep right up to the docks, Max pulled in by the small boathouse where David kept his boat. It had been a while since he'd been out on the boat, and he was looking forward to it. He always enjoyed riding the waves and feeling the cool spray of water on his face. Tossing the keys to David, he left the Jeep and headed for the interior of the boathouse. He stopped just inside the shade of the open doorway and paused to look at the boat. It was an old trawler leased from some local fishermen, and David kept them employed to take him to the various places he needed to visit for his research. Already equipped with side booms and winches, the trawler made an excellent research vessel with the ability to launch and recover diving cages and large fish. Below the aft deck, a large externally aerated live well accommodated even the largest of specimens, keeping them alive for transport to the research facility. "Greetings, senor," Jose, the captain of the boat, called as he saw the men walking toward the boat. "Are we going to take the boat out today?" "Yes, Jose," David said. "Please make sure we're ready to leave as soon as possible. I want to go to the kelp beds, and then possibly we will do a little fishing." "Fishing, senor?" Juan, the captain's brother and first mate, appeared over the gunwales, raising his hat above his eyes. He was smiling and obviously liked the idea of doing a little fishing. "We're going to catch marlin or some tuna, maybe?" "No, I was thinking we would try to find a shark I tagged this morning," David said as he climbed aboard the boat. "But sharks are not as good for eating, senor," Jose said from the con as he started up the boat. "I think maybe Juan is right. We should go for tuna or marlin." David laughed and found a comfortable place to sit as they got ready to get underway. "I'll tell you what, fellas. If there's still enough time left in the day after my work in catching the shark, we can definitely go fish for some tuna or marlin, and your wives can both cook fish for us tonight." "Excellent," Juan said, and moved to cast off the lines tying the boat to the dock. It was an honor for them to have the boss want to eat what their wives cooked. Jose shifted the boat into reverse and slowly increased the throttle to back the boat from the mooring. As the bow passed the plane of the entrance, he spun the wheel to the right to make the stern move to the right, and the bow swung out away from the dock. When he was clear, he shifted the boat into forward, pointed the bow at the bay opening, and set the throttle for a slow exit from the harbor. "So why do you want to catch this shark, senor?" Juan asked as he coiled ropes and stored them in a box on the deck. "They are not much good for eating." "True," David said. "There are better fish for eating. But I saw a shark this morning with a growth sticking out from his side, and I want to see what it was." "A growth?" Juan seemed puzzled. "Like a remora?" "No, it wasn't another fish," David said patiently. "It was like an extra fin sticking out the side of the fish." "Oh, I understand, senor," Juan said, smiling. "My sister had a boy with 6 toes, and we used to like to look at him, too. This is what you mean, no?" "Yes, that's what I mean," David confirmed, although he was quite sure that the growth was not a congenital disorder. "Hey, Juan," Max interrupted. "You guys got any beers on this boat?" "Oh, yes, senor," Juan said, smiling, and opened up the ice machine at the back of the cabin. Bottlenecks jutted out from the ice within like a small brown forest. "We always make sure to have plenty of beer. It's not good to eat your lunch without something to drink." David and Max accepted the beers and walked to the transom. The water behind the boat churned with white bubbles in the blue water, making a pale green trail behind them. Seagulls flew in lazy circles around the boat, diving occasionally at a small fish or other creature stirred up by the propeller wash. Some of them called to the men as if to wish them luck or beg for food. As the boat neared the opening to the sea beyond, Jose pushed the throttles forward and the boat began to speed up, pushing through the small waves at the breakers. Max relaxed his legs, allowing his knees to bend as the boat rose and fell with each wave. Once past the breakers, the water calmed again and the boat turned west to follow the island around the south. The evening sun was still high in the sky, indicating at least 3 or 4 more hours of daylight. It cast golden rays along the western side of the island, lighting the rock formations in sharp relief. Max found himself wondering what it must have been like when the islands first formed. He imagined himself watching from a boat offshore like he was now and started to laugh. "What's so funny?" David asked. "I was just thinking it would have been great to watch these islands form from a boat offshore just like this. And I realized that not only had boats not been invented when the island formed, but neither had humans." He laughed again. "You have a twisted sense of humor, my friend," David said and tipped his beer bottle toward Max. Looking to the south, David saw the west beach coming up and turned to speak to the captain. "Jose, pull up at the vents by the west beach," he said, walking toward the cabin where he kept his tools. "I want to draw samples from the plumes there." David turned to ready several sampling tubes while the boat slowed and turned toward the shore. After a few minutes, he heard the engines slow and knew they were getting close. Grabbing his gear, he followed the deck around the cabin to the bow and waited at the rail. The engines reversed strong for a moment before he heard the transmission shift to neutral as the boat stopped. Looking down, Max saw the water was stirring from the plumes. There was no evidence of oil here either, but he could feel the heat coming off of the water. He watched as David drew several samples before turning back to Jose. "Okay, I got it," he said and headed astern. "Let's head for the kelp beds." Stowing the samples in the tool cabinet, he removed a video camera and length of cable. Handing these to Max, he grabbed a tripod stand and headed up to the bridge. Max followed with the equipment and waited patiently as David set the tripod up and secured it to the stations on the floor he had built on a previous occasion. After mounting the camera and connecting the cable, he ran the cable to the con and plugged it in before reaching up to turn on an overhead monitor. The monitor lit up immediately, showing them a field of blue with waving lines of light yellow. David focused the camera on the water in front of the boat and checked the monitor. The field was entirely blue now. He reached over and turned on the digital recorder and settled back to await their arrival at the kelp beds. Small disturbances in the water ahead indicated they were nearing the kelp beds, and Jose eased back on the throttle to slow them. The camera was showing the rising plumes of hot water in shades of red and orange on the monitor now, and David watched them waver back and forth. "Seems like the current is flowing away from the island, Jose," he said, looking over the water. "Position us to that side of the kelp beds and let her drift sideways toward the kelp. That should give us the best position for an approach." David turned to Max. "Would you mind helping Juan get the cage assembled while I get Jose in position?" "Not at all, man," Max said and returned to the aft deck. David watched Max and Juan assembling the diving cage while he opened the cabinet behind the con and got out his wetsuit. In moments, he was suited up and ready for the dive. He checked the monitors as the boat drifted toward the vents and waited until he was sure they were within reach before asking Jose to drop the anchor. The anchor hit the water with a splash, and David felt the boat start to turn alongside the kelp beds as the anchor stopped the bow from moving. In a few moments, the boat was facing the cliffs with the kelp beds off the starboard side. This was good, as the pivoting side boom would allow some movement of the cage fore and aft, in case he needed to be closer or farther from the vents. He left the bridge to get his tanks and check the cage assembly. Within a few minutes, he was ready to dive. David stepped into the cage and put his face mask on. It was a full face mask, which allowed him to communicate with the surface through a closed-circuit intercom. "Can you hear me?" he asked, checking the system. "Read you loud and clear, buddy," Max said, keying the microphone on the handset. "You ready to go swimming?" "Oh, yeah," David said, patting his belt to make sure his tubes were there. "Go ahead and set the cage in the water." Max stood back and let Juan operate the controls of the winch. The cage lifted slowly above the deck from the side boom until it cleared the rail, and Juan lowered the boom to swing the cage over and toward the water. When it was resting beside the boat above the water, he looked to David for instructions. Using standard crane hand signals, David held one hand out palm up and pointed to it with the index finger of his other hand from above while moving the finger in a slow circle. Slowly the cage settled into the water until only the last foot was showing, and Juan stopped. "You got good air, David?" Max asked, watching in case David pulled his head above water in the cage. "Roger that. I'm good to go," David said happily. "It's beautiful down here today. Go ahead and lower me. I'll say when to stop." Hearing this, Juan allowed the winch to release more cable and watched as the cage disappeared from view. Now he listened intently to the speaker on the radio for further instructions. It always made him nervous to be at the controls of the winch because he knew there were things under the water that could cause problems, and he did not want to be responsible for problems. "Okay, stop there," David said. "I'm about 4 feet off the bottom and can see the vents clearly within reach." Max walked to the rail to look down into the water. The cage was about 10 feet below the boat, and he could see David clearly. He watched as David gathered the first 2 samples. As he was reaching out for the third, Max saw a shadow racing through the water along the edge of the kelp toward the cage. Before he could turn and tell David to watch out over the radio, a very large shark slammed into the cage with so much force it rocked the boat. "Get him out of there now, Juan!" Max screamed and watched as the shark thrashed its tail, pushing at the cage. "Holy shit!" David yelled as the shark hit the cage. "Get him off me!" The speaker went dead as a cloud of blood erupted from the cage, and Max wondered if it was David's or the shark's. He could see the communication cable had been ripped free and hoped David's air was still intact. He prayed it was the fish's blood as the cage began to rise to the surface and wondered why the fish was still thrashing at the cage. It was as if it was driven to get at David. As the cage came out of the water, the thrashing of the shark caused it to swing wildly, and Max backed away to the far rail to get out of the way. The shark was stuck between the bars of the cage, and he could see David's limp body curled in the corner away from the fish. There was a lot of blood on his head and upper torso. His leg, which was now just inches from the shark's gaping mouth, was mangled badly below the knee. David appeared to be unconscious. Juan swung the cage over the deck, and it fell with the bottom of the cage pointed toward the bow. He ran over and released the pins from the bottom of the cage to pull David out as Max rushed to help him. Together, they got him free of the cage and the thrashing shark. "Jose!" Max yelled to the man standing up at the con watching helplessly. "Get us to the docks. He has to get to the hospital now, and radio ahead so an ambulance will meet us at the dock." Jose did as instructed and began to turn the boat to the south while the anchor was still being reeled in by the electric winch. When the anchor seated at the bow, he rammed the throttle forward to make the boat go as fast as possible. Switching to the emergency channel on the radio, he called for help. "Tiburon Patrol, this is Research Vessel, Climate 1. Do you read?" Jose called. "This is Ranger Station, Climate 1. Go ahead." "We have an emergency," Jose said, with more calm than he felt. "The owner of the boat has been attacked by a shark, and we need an ambulance to meet us at the dock in East Harbor. Arrival time is estimated at 30 minutes. "Roger, Climate 1, came the reply. "We will forward your request to the hospital immediately." "Thank you," Jose said, and returned the microphone to the radio. He turned to yell back to Max. "The Rangers are having the ambulance meet us at the dock. How is David?" "Not good," Max said, and turned back to care for David. Once they had him free and away from the shark, Max realized that the shark had taken David's right arm off just below the shoulder. As he wrapped his belt around the top of the arm to make a tourniquet, he found himself thankful the arm was not severed closer to the shoulder. If it had been, he would have been able to do nothing to stop the bleeding. Turning to the wounds at his leg, there was a lot of muscle damage, but the arteries seemed to be intact as the bleeding was not spurting. He tied a piece of cloth around David's thigh to slow the blood flow and wrapped the wound with another piece of cloth. Several of the shark's teeth fell onto the deck from the rubber suit as he worked on the leg. Juan came back to his side with a pair of scissors and was about to cut the wetsuit off David when Max grabbed his arm to stop him. "What are you doing?" he asked. "It will be easier for him to breathe out of the suit," Juan said, "and we can look to see if there are more injuries." "No," Max said. "He lost a lot of blood, and that suit is applying pressure to keep his blood at the core of his body. If we remove it, he could go into shock and die. If there are any wounds, they aren't life-threatening or the rubber would be cut away. Juan put the scissors down and sat back against the rail looking at the shark. The fish was still now, but it was not dead. He felt Max looking at him and looked his way. They shared a silent prayer before looking to the shark again. Max looked at the shark, and the first thing he noticed was the tag sticking out of the fish's back. Could it be the same fish they tagged this morning? There was no way to know without checking the records and the serial number on the tag. He recalled having seen a large shark at the lagoon not long after they tagged the shark this morning, and then here was the tagged shark that attacked David. Was it coincidence? Getting up from the deck, he walked around the shark to look at its side and stopped when he saw the growth there. Early morning sun warmed his face as Max woke to the sound of the island bell tolling. The bell was located in the steeple of a church a couple blocks away, but it was still very loud inside his apartment. He listened while looking around through half-open eyes. It was 6 a.m. His thoughts turned to the previous day. Upon regaining consciousness, David expressed confusion as to his current state. It seems as though the entire event either happened too fast for him to realize, or his mind was blocking it out. He was unaware of losing his right arm until he woke up, and it had been very upsetting. Thankfully, the doctor was able to save his leg, but it was causing him a lot of pain in addition to the shock of losing his arm. They gave him a sedative to calm him, and Max stayed until he slept again. After leaving David at the hospital, Max came home and made something to eat before falling into bed exhausted. Laying there this morning, he felt as though he hadn't slept at all and knew it was because of emotional drain. He got out of the bed and, stepping into his slippers, began his morning routine to get the day started. The shower seemed to bring him back to life, igniting a surge of thoughts regarding the previous day and the shark involved. He was eager to get to the lab and examine the one they had in captivity with the anomaly on its side. He prepared a light breakfast and tried to relax while he ate, focusing on other things. As a distraction, he turned the television on to catch the news. There was no mention of either shark attack on the island, which was not unusual, and elsewhere in the world, things seemed normal. Finishing up, he cleaned the dishes and put them away so he wouldn't have to deal with it later, and prepared to head for the lab. Then the phone rang. It was the hospital calling to let him know David would board a flight to the U.S. this morning for treatment and rehabilitation. Max knew David was in for a long, hard recovery, but he had faith his friend would pull through in the end. He decided to meet him at the docks and see him off before beginning to study the shark. There were fewer people on the docks this morning as the cruise ship prepared to leave the harbor. Long and white, the ship parked at the end of the docks blocked the view of the open sea to the east as it cast long morning shadows on other boats. It reminded him of the girl whose husband was killed. He was surprised she would not be reboarding the ship and had decided to stay on the island. He also felt a bit guilty. It had not occurred to him nor David to warn them about the shark in the lagoon. The shark left, and since there had never been an attack there before, it didn't seem to be an issue. He pushed those thoughts away and walked out to the dock where the float plane sat waiting for passengers. The only person around was the pilot, and he was busy checking the plane over for the return flight to the mainland. Max settled onto a nearby bench to wait for the ambulance to bring David and looked into the clear water around him. A small school of bonito, flickering silver glints as they passed, swam through the docks chasing smaller fish. They scattered as a predator swam through them. He couldn't see the predator, but knew from experience it was probably a barracuda or shark. They reformed after the danger passed and returned to their original course. At the base of the dock pilings, angelfish picked at barnacles and other small crustaceans, while hermit crabs scoured the sand bottom for scraps amid a flurry of small fish flitting about. The water was alive with life. The sound of a vehicle downshifting came close, and Max looked up to see the ambulance arriving. It was an old panel truck, painted white with a large red cross on the side. The driver backed slowly down the dock now, closer to the plane, and he waited for them to stop before getting up. The back doors swung open, and two orderlies jumped down, pulling out the gurney where his friend lay. He waited for them to extend the legs of the gurney to roll him to the plane before approaching. A nurse climbed from the cab, carrying a small kit bag of supplies, and checked over her patient. She adjusted the IV hanging from a stalk on the gurney and went to talk to the pilot. "Hey, David," Max said with more cheer than he felt. "I see you get to go flying again." David looked bad. While his color was good, he seemed depressed and withdrawn. He managed a weak smile. "Yeah, but the nurse won't let me have a window seat," he complained. "She said I might get nauseated and break my stitches if I get sick. She even gave me a shot of motion sickness medicine to make sure that didn't happen." "Well, yeah, buddy," Max reached out and squeezed his good hand. "This trip is intended to make you better, not worse. Just think, in a few hours, you'll be in the modern city surrounded by pretty nurses, getting sponge baths. The doctor said my leg will heal fine, and I won't even have a lot of ugly scars." David smiled for real this time. He said I would have to have a prosthetic arm, but I told him that would only be for a little while. I said I'm going to study lizards in the desert to find out how they regenerate body parts and use the information to heal myself. Max laughed at this. "If anyone could do it, I know you can, buddy." "I'm sorry to interrupt, gentlemen," the pilot said, walking up, "but we have to get going now if you're going to catch your connecting flight, sir." "Okay, no problem," David said and waved to an orderly he was ready. "Take care of yourself, Max. Don't let them get you too, man." "Don't you worry about me," Max said. "I have this well in hand and will forward you reports. You just get well." "Oh, feel free to use my place and boat," he said as they started to roll in toward the plane. "They're already paid for, and if I don't keep them active, I will lose my funding. Besides, your lab isn't set up for live specimen studies like mine is, and I know you were eager to examine that shark." "Thanks, David." Max stopped as they reached the plane. "I'll take good care of your lab and file your samples for your study when you get back. I'm going to miss you, man." "You too, Max," David said, holding his thumb up. Max watched as they loaded David into the plane and his nurse climbed in beside him. He waved once more as they were closing the doors and fought to keep his emotions in check. Sure, David said he was coming back, but in his heart, Max knew his friend would not return. It could never be the same, especially since the shark was able to get him through the cage, which was supposed to protect him. That really bothered him. How had the shark managed to exert enough force to bend the aluminum bars and actually get at David? He intended to examine the cage closer when he had a chance. Shielding his face from the water spray thrown up from the plane as it turned away from the dock, Max stood still, as if to show his friend he would be here for him, until the plane lifted from the water and disappeared from sight. Max sat back in the seat and relaxed as he waited for takeoff. He was on his way to visit David. Finally, after 2.5 months, he had recovered enough to realize who Max was when he telephoned. It had been touch and go for a long time as he struggled to heal not only from wounds, but the infection in his brain as well. It was confirmed that he had encephalitis and suffered debilitating brain damage. He was, in fact, lucky to have survived it all. He let his mind wander over the past summer and all that had happened. His studies of the anomaly sharks were going well, and he used them to fill in the time while he was waiting for cultures to develop from his original research. He had yet to isolate the carcinogenic factor in crude oil, but was confident that his studies of the sharks and the oil together would lead him to what he sought. The plane began to roll quickly down the runway, and Max watched out the window as they lifted off. He was on his way home to Louisiana for a while. Sitting back again, Max relaxed and finally drifted off to sleep. When he awoke, they were parked at the terminal of the airport. He made his way through customs quickly, got his luggage, and rented a car. He was wide awake now and looking forward to seeing his old friend. Pulling up at David's grandmama's home, Max stopped at the end of the long driveway just to take it in. Giant oak trees lined both sides of the drive, covered in Spanish moss that seemed to run from them like water. The grass was neatly cut all the way to the block walls surrounding the front of the property, and small gardens of flowers dotted the lawns. The house was old Victorian, with large white columns to the roof and ornate woodwork at the eaves. Large windows framed with black shutters stood out against the white of the house. A balcony on the center of the second floor overlooked a long driveway and front porch below, while smaller walkouts projected from dormers on the sharply pitched roof. And finally, the front doors, made of two huge 8-foot-tall slabs of hand-carved wood, they stood guard between guests and residents. Max parked the car to the side of the driveway and walked up to the door. He was about to reach for the doorbell when the door opened and he was greeted by a small, frail woman at least 80 years old. She smiled and motioned him inside. "You must be Max," she said. He recognized her voice from the telephone calls he made and realized she sounded much younger on the phone than she looked in real life. "Yes, ma'am, I'm Max," he said and took off his coat. "Thank you for taking my calls and telling me about David." "No, thank you, Cher," she said. "You the only one who ever called to see how my grandbaby boy is doing." "Well, he was always a good friend to me," Max said and followed her through the house to the garden out back. "So how is he? Has he regained his function back?" "He still talk like the mouth don't work and his hands don't always do what he wants them to. But you can look in his eyes and see the fire there." She turned and smiled at him. "Did you kill that fish that did this to my grandbaby boy?" "Yes, ma'am," Max said. "You good boy, Max. I bet you mama real proud." She pointed through the garden doors. "Dave is setting there yon table under the willow tree. Strong powers the willow tree. She help him heal good, she do. You go see. I get us some coffee." Max laid his coat and bag near the door and walked through the French doors to the garden. David was sitting with his back to the house where he could look out over the bayou a short distance away. The garden smelled of sweet honeysuckle and magnolia blossoms. He walked around to the side so David would see him coming and wouldn't be startled. "Hi, David," Max said. "How you doing, buddy?" Max could see he wasn't doing well at all. His muscle control was deteriorated and he was having trouble holding his head up. He was slouched down and one leg splayed limply to the side. "Hi, Max," he said, looking up. "I've really missed you being on the island," Max said, overlooking the way David said his name to make it sound like Mux. "I miss you too," David said and looked into Max's eyes. Like the old woman had said, Max could see the fire in his eyes. He seemed to be struggling to prove it since he couldn't overcome his physical inabilities. "David, I can see your mind is working fine. Don't worry that you have trouble talking. I have all the time in the world and will wait for you until you can tell me what you want to say. I will try my best to understand," Max smiled. David seemed to light up at this. It was as if he was okay inside but not on the outside, and this frustrated him to no end. He smiled and tried to look over his shoulder. The old woman was coming back with coffee for the three of them. She smiled sweetly. "See? David is healing fine and will be his old self in no time at all," she said and set the tray on the table. Max looked at David and then to the old woman and thought to himself that Grandmama was full of wishful thinking, because there was no way back from this. He accepted a cup of coffee and waited for her to sit with them, but she took her coffee and moved over under another tree so they could talk. David was holding a brownish-green gecko in his good hand and a magnifying glass in his prosthetic hand. Looking through the magnifying glass, he set the lizard on the table and pinched its tail off. The lizard immediately ran away and he sat back frustrated. He said, I keep trying to study how they grow their tail back so I can fix my arm, but every time I pull its tail off, the lizard runs out from under the microscope." Max felt his heart breaking all over again. I hope you enjoyed this peek into my novel, Tides of Evolution. If you'd like to read the whole story, it's available on Amazon.com. Link is in the description. That's all for now, but I'll be back again next Friday with another story, just for you. Until then, sleep well.